Shadows of the wilderness when bullets glance harmlessly off the hide of the towering 8-foot monstrosity, pursuing you through the twilight forest. And you find yourself whispering desperate pleas to the ancient pines surrounding you. Perhaps then you'll understand why the old-timers warned you never to hunt these woods after sunset. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Tonight, I present a fresh collection from our archives of chilling wilderness encounters. In this episode, you'll hear testimonies of colossal winged anomalies, sinister mountain entities, inexplicable disappearances, and creatures that defy natural classification. Prepare yourself for what awaits in the shadows. Submit your personal unexplained encounters at darkstories.org so I can bring them to life on the show. I should mention my new book, Creepy Campfire Stories, a meticulously crafted collection of spine-tingling wilderness tales, perfect for telling around flickering flames. This beautifully designed hardcover is a must-have for any lover of the macabre. Find Creepy Campfire Stories on Amazon, or follow the link in the description. The first 100 pre-orders will receive the exclusive limited edition Darkness Prevails plush collectible. Only 100 will ever exist, and to claim yours, you must pre-order Creepy Campfire Stories on Amazon, and verify your order through the link below. Stock is extremely limited. Plush ships after the book releases on July 8, 2025. Thank you for your support. Now, let us descend into darkness. The Pale Crawler of British Columbia. From Ripness. I've hunted elk in northern British Columbia for 15 years. Many claim familiarity with these woods, but I've developed a profound understanding of this wilderness, its rhythms, its dangers, its secrets. I've encountered territorial wolves and aggressive bears. No mountain lions yet, though their presence lingers in the back of my mind. I share this background because what I witnessed during my expedition last November defies all rational explanation, and restful sleep has eluded me since. I prefer solitary hunting. There's something primally satisfying about self-reliance in the wild, making every decision without another human voice, breaking nature's hypnotic spell. My favorite location lies about 40 miles north of Fort Nelson, deep within the boreal forest, where few venture, especially after the first snow blankets the landscape. Upon arrival, I tracked a small elk herd through pristine powder, established my camp near a frozen creek, and settled into the hunt's familiar cadence. The cold that year was brutal, temperatures plummeting to -30 degrees Celsius at night. I came prepared with proper gear and a well-insulated tent, confident in my ability to withstand the elements. Everything changed on the fourth morning. I woke before dawn and hiked about 2 miles from camp to a ridge overlooking a small valley where I'd spotted promising elk tracks the previous day. As sunlight fully illuminated the landscape, I noticed movement in a clearing below. Initially, I assumed it was an injured animal dragging itself through the snow. I raised my binoculars for a closer look, and what I saw still crystallizes my blood. It wasn't an animal, not any natural one. The figure was unmistakably humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable dimension. It was completely hairless, with skin so pale it nearly vanished against the snow, save for a sickly grayish-blue tint that reminded me of hypothermia victims I'd seen in medical textbooks. It moved on all fours, but not as a human would crawl. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, and it navigated the snow with disturbing efficiency, like a pale, unclothed entity, immune to the biting cold. I watched, paralyzed. The creature approached what I could now identify as a dead snowshoe hare. Without hesitation, it began to consume the hare, tearing into it with bare hands and teeth. Though the temperature remained well below freezing, this exposed entity showed no signs of discomfort, no shivering, no visible breath crystallizing in the frigid air, no indication it experienced cold at all. For 15 minutes, I observed this bizarre being through my binoculars. Thankfully, it never looked my way, focusing entirely on its meal. When finished, it simply crawled away, disappearing into the dense forest, with unnervingly fluid speed. I abandoned my hunt that day, retreating to camp, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it some person suffering from severe mental illness, who had somehow survived these hostile conditions, but without clothing in lethal temperatures, moving in that anatomically impossible manner? The rational part of my brain couldn't accept these contradictions. Deep down, I knew this was something beyond conventional understanding, something that defied natural classification. I considered packing immediately, but my hard-earned time off was precious, and I'd planned this hunt for months. Surely nothing would happen to me, right? I'd only seen the entity from a distance. That night in my tent, every snapping twig made me flinch. I kept my rifle loaded beside my sleeping bag, a cold comfort against whatever lurked beyond the canvas. The next day, I stayed closer to camp, unwilling to venture far, but determined to salvage my hunt. I managed to take down a young elk in the early afternoon, about half a mile from my tent. Field dressing took longer than anticipated, and dusk was settling as I finished. I returned to camp as the sun disappeared, mentally planning how I'd transport the meat the next morning. As I approached my campsite, I noticed the entrance flap to my tent was open, though I distinctly remembered securing it that morning. I raised my weapon and called out, thinking perhaps another hunter had discovered my camp. The forest answered with silence. Moving closer, scanning the area cautiously, I saw it. Emerging from my tent, crawling headfirst on all fours, the same pale entity from the previous day. In the fading light, I could now see its features more clearly. Its face was almost human, but with a feral quality that defied categorization. Its eyes reflected the dying light, like an animal's tapetum lucidum, not a person's normal retinal response. Our gazes locked. It recognized me as a sentient being, and I recognized it as something beyond my comprehension. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty, I faced something supernatural. Its mouth opened, revealing pointed teeth. I fired reflexively, pure instinct born of terror. It flinched but didn't flee immediately. Instead, it continued staring at me for several seconds before finally crawling backward, with that same disturbing spider-like movement, and disappearing into the underbrush. I rushed to my tent, dreading what I might find inside. Everything remained as I'd left it, except for my sleeping bag, unzipped and laid open, as if prepared for someone or something to crawl inside. How did it know to do that? I packed immediately, abandoning some gear in my haste. I hiked through the night, to reach my truck, using my headlamp and the full moon's illumination, never stopping once. Whenever fatigue threatened, the creature's face flashed in my mind, renewing my desperate energy. To this day, I struggle to rationalize what I encountered. Perhaps it was a person with some severe condition, or perhaps it was truly supernatural, an entity that doesn't belong in our reality. I've researched regional cryptids and legends extensively, but nothing aligns with what I saw. Whatever it was, it haunts the periphery of my vision whenever darkness falls. The Winged Colossus from Anonymous. Every October since my sons turned 18, the three of us have maintained our tradition of duck hunting together. One is 32 now, the other 29, both with families of their own. But when autumn arrives, we still make time to wade into the marshes of eastern Iowa, with our waders, shotguns, and our loyal chocolate lab, Duke. Last season we visited our usual location at a lake near Cedar Rapids, that I'll leave unnamed for privacy reasons. It's secluded enough that we rarely encounter other hunters, though not exactly secret. That morning began perfectly. Clear skies ideal for duck hunting. We established our position in our favorite patch of reeds, around 5:30 a.m., arranged decoys in the shallow water, and settled in to wait. Duke waited eagerly, at my older son's side, occasionally whining in anticipation. By 7 a.m., several mallard groups were circling the area. Everything pointed toward an excellent hunt. A flock of approximately 15 mallards approached from the north, in their classic V formation. We readied our shotguns. As they descended toward our decoys,
But instead of their usual controlled landing, the entire flock suddenly dropped, not gracefully, but as if yanked downward by invisible forces. They splashed into the water about 60 yards away, then remained eerily still. "What was that about?" my younger son asked. I shrugged, suggesting they might have spotted us. But truthfully, I'd never witnessed birds behave this way before. We attempted some calls, but the ducks remained motionless on the water's surface. From what I could observe, they appeared alive and alert, heads swiveling nervously, yet they wouldn't move. My older son sent Duke to flush them, expecting them to take flight when approached. Duke swam out enthusiastically, but even with him splashing just feet away, the ducks merely paddled in tight circles, refusing to fly. "I've never seen them like this," I told my son. In 30 years of duck hunting, I'd witnessed birds, spooked, comfortable, even seemingly mocking our decoy arrangements, but never too terrified to fly. These birds were so frightened, they'd rather face a potential predator than take to the air. My younger son stood, waving and shouting to flush them out, but even this failed. The ducks huddled closer, quacking softly. Then we heard it, a sound that instantly raised the hair on my neck. An extremely high-pitched screech cut through the air, unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It began similar to a distant hawk's cry, but rose in pitch and volume, until it seemed to vibrate inside my skull. Duke whimpered and swam frantically back to shore, shaking violently, as my older son pulled him in. "Dad, what is that?" my younger son asked, his voice tense with a fear I hadn't heard since he was a child. The sound repeated, much louder, from somewhere behind us over the tree line. We all turned toward it, and that's when the shadow fell over us. Something massive moved above the pine trees at the marsh's edge. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. Was it a low-flying aircraft that had strayed from Cedar Rapids Airport? But planes don't have wings that flap. As it cleared the tree line and soared directly overhead, my heart nearly stopped. This was definitively a living creature, with a wingspan stretching perhaps 70 feet or more. Its body was elongated and serpentine, covered in what appeared to be scales, or extremely leathery skin that caught the early morning light. The head was wrong for any bird, elongated like a prehistoric reptile's, with a ridge of spines running down its neck and back. It flew terrifyingly low, approximately twice the height of the tallest pines, close enough that I could see the leathery texture of its wings, and how its long tail whipped behind for balance. For a split second, it looked down at us with eyes that seemed ancient and coldly intelligent. Without thinking, I shouted, "Run!" We sprinted through the marsh, clutching our shotguns against our chests. Duke led the way, making straight for the truck. The creature screeched again as it passed overhead. The sound was so powerful, I could see it vibrate the water around our legs. It continued eastward over the marsh, before eventually disappearing. We reached our truck in record time, piling in with Duke still dripping in the back seat. We sat in stunned silence, until my older son finally spoke. "Did we all just see the same thing? Tell me what you saw." My younger one answered first. "That was something prehistoric, Dad, that looked like something from another age." I couldn't argue. It appeared reptilian, reminiscent of creatures from ancient epochs. Certainly not something that should be soaring over eastern Iowa. After some debate, we gathered the courage to retrieve our abandoned gear. The ducks that had been paralyzed with fear were gone. If they were brave enough to return to the sky, perhaps we were safe. Everything in the marsh seemed to have returned to normal, but we never went back to that spot. We found new hunting grounds, and become friendlier with other hunters we encounter. The isolation that once felt peaceful now feels dangerously vulnerable. I have never run so quickly in my life.
The forest that screamed from infrequency these days. All I have left is deer hunting. But that's enough for me. After 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines, the forest's quiet offers profound therapy. My hunting partner, whom I'll call Min, served in my unit, We bonded over our New England roots and maintained contact after discharge 5 years ago, united by our shared love for hunting. Each year we escape from jobs and daily life to spend a week tracking deer through the mountains, drinking bourbon by the fire, rarely discussing what we witnessed overseas. One November we established camp near the Glastonbury mountain area, a region known for good hunting, but also for local folklore about disappearances, strange sounds, and other backwoods tales that men and I would dismiss over beers at the local tavern. As former Marines, we'd witnessed genuine horror. Ghost stories hardly affected us. Several days into our expedition, the weather unexpectedly turned cold. Light snow had fallen overnight, making tracking easier but hunting more challenging. We separated mid-morning, planning to reconvene by early afternoon. I moved slowly through dense maples when I noticed movement about 80 yards ahead. Through my rifle scope, I expected to see a buck. Instead, what I saw stopped my heart. A human figure hung from a large oak tree. I immediately lowered my rifle and approached. As I drew closer, there was no doubt, a man suspended by a rope, swaying slightly in the breeze. The body appeared weathered, as if exposed for weeks or months. The clothing was tattered, and the face was unrecognizable due to exposure and apparent animal activity. I radioed men, "I need you at my position now." His response was immediate. "Something wrong, what's your location?" "About half a mile northeast of our split point." There's a body out here." I provided more precise directions while keeping my eyes fixed on the hanging figure. Something felt profoundly wrong beyond the obvious horror of finding human remains. Despite the apparent state of decay, no birds or insects surrounded the body. Even in cold weather, this seemed unusual. The entire area around the tree was unnaturally silent. Mem arrived about 10 minutes later, breathing hard from running. "Dear God," he whispered upon seeing it. His Marine training activated immediately. "We need to report this," I nodded, already retrieving my cell phone. Surprisingly, I had 1 bar of service. I dialed 911 and waited for connection. That's when M grabbed my arm. "Wait, look." I glanced up. The body was still there, swaying gently as before. I blinked rapidly, and impossibly, while the rope remained, the body had vanished completely. "Did you see that?" I couldn't finish my thought. Mem nodded slowly, his face pale beneath his cold reddened cheeks. "It's gone. It just disappeared." I looked at the ground beneath the rope, hoping the body had simply fallen, but there was nothing. It had completely vanished. Before the 911 operator answered, I disconnected. I couldn't articulate what had just happened. We stood in stunned silence for several moments, staring at the empty rope still hanging from the branch. "We need to go," Mem finally said. "Now." At that precise moment, a cry tore through the forest, distinctly female, coming from somewhere to our right. Before I could react, another cry answered from the left, then another from behind us. Within seconds, the entire forest erupted with women's voices from every direction, the cries seeming to emerge from everywhere simultaneously. Mem yelled, "Move!" and we both sprinted toward the forest edge, about half a mile away. The wailing intensified as we ran, growing louder each second. It reminded me of the aftermath of catastrophic incidents overseas. That raw, agonized sound that haunts you long after you've left the battlefield. But these were all women's voices, dozens of them, surrounding us completely. We raced through the forest, narrowly avoiding fallen logs and underbrush. I clutched my rifle close, realizing it offered little protection against whatever supernatural phenomenon we were experiencing. Eventually, the wailing became nearly deafening. I focused solely on running straight ahead, refusing to look anywhere else. Soon we broke through the tree line into an open field bordering the forest road where we'd parked our truck. The exact moment our boots touched the open ground beyond the trees, the screaming stopped completely. It didn't fade or diminish, it simply ceased, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the world. Mem, breathing heavily, looked at me. We turned back toward the forest together. The woods stood silent and still, appearing as peaceful and ordinary as any New England forest in November. "This place is cursed," Mem finally managed. I agreed wholeheartedly. Nothing in my years of hunting those woods, or even my tours in conflict zones, had prepared me for what we'd just experienced. We packed our camp in record time, and drove 3 hours without stopping. We talked constantly during the drive, debating various theories about what had occurred, eventually settling on some form of shared hallucination, though neither of us recalled consuming anything that might cause such an experience. We still hunt occasionally, but we've never returned to those particular woods. Some places in this world are not meant for human presence. The forest guardian's child from way out here. My wife and I have hunted the Ouachita Mountains since before our marriage. This experience occurred in late June 1997, a story I've wanted to share for years. That summer was brutally hot. We'd spotted a small deer herd moving through our back property earlier that week, and decided to spend Saturday morning in our tree stand, about 2 miles into the national forest bordering our land. We'd been there since before dawn, positioned about 15 feet up an old oak, with excellent visibility of a small clearing and game trail. By mid-morning, the woods were quiet, except for occasional bird calls, but no deer appeared, and the heat intensified. Donna was dozing against the trunk, while I kept watch, sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos. Eventually I noticed something unusual at the base of a pine tree, about 30 yards ahead. Initially, I thought it was a bear cub, an impressive sight, though concerning given that the mother was likely nearby. I nudged Donna, awake, pressed my finger to my lips, and pointed. The creature was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, crouched by the tree base. As we observed, we realized this wasn't a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its proportions all wrong. Its arms were unnaturally long, and its head seemed directly attached to its shoulders, with virtually no neck. Dark brown hair or fur covered its body, shorter than a bear's coat, but unlike any animal I recognized. The hair was shorter on its face, which I could see in profile, as it concentrated on its activity. "What on earth is that?" Donna whispered. I shook my head, unable to identify it, but couldn't look away. The creature appeared to be playing with the pine tree's bark, peeling strips, and examining them before discarding them. Its movements were precise, unlike a bear cub, more reminiscent of a mature primate. Occasionally it would pause and scan its surroundings, but never looked toward our position. We watched for several minutes, utterly amazed. My weapon rested in my lap, completely forgotten, as we observed this non-human entity behaving with such intelligence. Donna finally voiced what we'd both been thinking. "That looks like a young forest guardian." I would have laughed if I hadn't been thinking the same thing. Everyone in our region has heard stories, claims of encounters with massive bipedal creatures in these woods, especially from hunters. I never gave much credence to these tales, enjoying them as campfire stories, but dismissing them afterward. The small creature had just discovered a beetle under a piece of bark and was watching it crawl across its palm when a deep resonant call echoed through the forest. It started low and rose to a powerful bellow that reverberated through the entire woodland. Though it originated perhaps a quarter-mile deeper in the forest, it carried with perfect clarity, as if emanating from beside us. The little creature's head snapped up instantly. It dropped the bark and beetle, emitting a high-pitched sound in response. Then it ran on 2 legs, toward the call's source, moving with surprising speed, before disappearing into the underbrush. My wife and I sat dumbfounded. I couldn't stop grinning at the extraordinary encounter. Suddenly, Donna gripped my hand. "We should probably leave, just in case." I understood her meaning immediately. Just as you avoid a mother bear, when cubs are present, you certainly don't want to encounter a parent of whatever we just witnessed. We gathered our equipment and departed.
later agreeing that we had indeed observed a juvenile forest guardian, and heard its parent calling it home. This world contains more wonders and mysteries than most people are willing to acknowledge. The spine-backed praetor, from Venetia. I first encountered the ancient predator when I was 12 years old, during the dry season of 1992, in the mountains outside Monterey. My father had taken me on my inaugural hunting trip for javelina, in a region bordering the eastern Sierra Madre. Lobo accompanied us, a magnificent black and tan Mexican shepherd mix, lean and intelligent, the finest tracking dog in our village. He'd been my faithful companion since I was 7, and I couldn't imagine hunting without him. "Tonight you become a hunter," my father told me proudly, as we established camp. We didn't use blinds or stands. Our method was straightforward: find a good vantage point, practice patience, and let Lobo track once we'd wounded our prey. We positioned ourselves against a rocky outcropping, overlooking a small watering hole. "Javelinas will come to drink at dusk," my father explained. The light was nearly gone when Lobo began to growl. "Quiet," my father whispered. But Lobo continued, unusually agitated. This wasn't his typical alertness, but something different. Even at my young age, I recognized the distinction. My father frowned. "I don't know what's out there." Suddenly, Lobo's growling ceased, and his ears perked up. He stared intently at the watering hole's opposite side, where thick brush grew. Without warning, he bolted, racing toward whatever he sensed. "Lobo, no!" I cried out, but he had already disappeared into the darkness. My father grabbed my arm as I started to follow. "Stay here," he commanded firmly. He reached for his flashlight, but before he could activate it, we heard Lobo's frantic barking, followed by a sound I'll never forget, something between a growl and a hiss, but with a rattling quality that would haunt my nightmares. Then came Lobo's pained yelp and sounds of struggle. My father switched on the flashlight, sweeping its beam toward the commotion. For a brief moment, the light illuminated the scene. Across the watering hole, an entity hunched over Lobo, its back toward us. The creature was hairless with grayish-green skin that glistened unnaturally in the light. Its spine protruded sharply, each vertebra visible through taut skin. Most disturbing were the spine-like projections running down its back, not fur, but actual quill-like structures. It turned its head toward our light, revealing large, round eyes that reflected the beam with an unnatural intensity. I couldn't discern a mouth, but Lobo's coat was dark with moisture. My father dropped the flashlight. I heard him fumbling with his weapon. Then he screamed at me to run. I remained frozen until my father grabbed my collar and dragged me backward. Only then did my legs remember their function. I'll never forget fleeing through the darkness, terrified, yet furious that something had harmed my beloved dog. We didn't stop running until we reached our truck. My father practically threw me into the passenger seat. Inside the vehicle, I repeatedly asked him what we'd seen. Finally, he uttered a single word: chupacabra. I'd heard tales about this creature. Everyone in our region had, but they were supposed to be mere legends, to frighten children into returning before dark, or to encourage better livestock protection. "We have to go back for Lobo," I pleaded. He shook his head. "Lobo is gone. There won't be anything to find, unless you want to share his fate." When we returned home, my father told my mother a mountain lion had taken Lobo. He never spoke of what we truly witnessed, not to anyone. When villagers reported livestock found drained of vital fluids in subsequent months, he would leave the room. Decades have passed. I've had other dogs since then, but I've never taken another hunting. Though I still occasionally hunt, I'm always back at my vehicle before sunset. The image of that entity, hunched over my dog's body, still haunts and infuriates me. My father went to his grave, never publicly acknowledging what we encountered that night. But I know what claimed Lobo from us, and it wasn't any mountain lion. Some ancient predators never left these mountains. They simply learned to hide better from us.
The subterranean visitors from Sinclair. I've lived and hunted my entire life in rural Kentucky, near the West Virginia border, on land my family has owned since before my grandfather's birth. Here, hunting represents a rite of passage, and my father taught me everything about tracking, patience, and respecting the forest. He always emphasized that the land harbored secrets older than any of us, phenomena that defied logical explanation. I dismissed these as superstition or folklore passed down to instill obedience in children. Growing up, I often heard about lights sometimes seen in the woods, flickering glimmers that vanished if approached. My grandfather swore he'd witnessed them multiple times, pale illuminations bobbing silently through the trees, always near a steep ravine at our family property's edge. He warned me never to venture near that ravine, recounting tales of hunters and hikers who vanished without trace. I respected his wishes out of love rather than belief, but something occurred during last year's deer season that has me questioning everything I thought I knew about these mountains. That morning was unusually cold for late October. The leaves had mostly fallen, carpeting the forest floor in noisy layers. I reached my tree stand just before sunrise, bundled in heavy gear with my grandfather's inherited rifle. Normally I find peace there, watching the woods awaken around me, but that day felt different from the beginning. An hour or two passed quietly, just bird songs and squirrels making their rounds, but around mid-morning, everything went eerily silent. No birds, no wind, not even distant traffic from the county road. It was as if the world had suddenly muted. I shivered, assuming perhaps a predator had silenced the forest. That's when I heard a sound I'll never forget, a distant metallic clang like someone striking an ancient church bell through the trees. The sound echoed, unnatural and hollow, immediately feeling wrong. Nothing like that exists anywhere near here. No old structures, no metal towers, nothing. Curiosity overcame me. I descended quietly and followed the noise, carefully navigating through thick vegetation, stepping slowly to conceal my presence. After several minutes, the metallic ringing recurred closer, clearer and strangely rhythmic, almost like deliberate call and response. I cautiously approached the steep ravine my grandfather had warned about, despite my better judgment. At the edge, I noticed a faint glint in the gully below, like sunlight reflecting off something metallic. Peering over, my heart plummeted. There, partially buried in moss and leaves, lay an enormous metal ring, like a wheel or hatch, embedded in the earth. Rusted and ancient-looking, nothing I'd ever seen before, approximately 10 feet across and half hidden by decades of forest growth. Most disturbing was the fresh soil around it, clearly recently disturbed, as if something had emerged. As I stared, another metallic clang sounded directly beneath me. The ground subtly vibrated under my feet. I scrambled backward, heart racing. Then I heard a low clicking sound, almost mechanical yet somehow organic. I froze behind a tree, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the rusted hatch. Slowly, something emerged. I had no idea what to expect, perhaps a reclusive survivalist. But that wasn't remotely close. This entity's body was covered in segmented plates, almost insect-like, faintly reflecting sunlight. Its limbs ended in strange appendages, and its head was small, featureless, and oval-shaped. It moved awkwardly with jerky, twitching motions, testing the air as if sensing something. Could it detect my presence already? My chest tightened with growing dread. I remained absolutely motionless, silently praying. After several agonizing moments, it retreated slowly toward the hatch, making that disturbing clicking noise, until it disappeared underground. I didn't hesitate another second. I bolted through the trees, abandoning all stealth, racing home at full speed. When I stumbled into our kitchen, pale and trembling, My father instantly recognized something was wrong. He listened silently as I described my experience. Rather than doubting me, he quietly admitted seeing lights in that ravine as a teenager but never approaching close enough to see more. He revealed that his father always believed something unnatural lay buried beneath our land, something best left undisturbed. Later, I brought a friend to show him the hatch. After a week of describing my encounter, his excitement overcame my fear, so I agreed to return. However, when we reached what I believed was the location, the hatch was gone. Even the surrounding area didn't match my recollection. It seemed impossible. Either I'd completely misremembered the route, or something far stranger was at work. To this day, when I hear whispered stories about strange lights or disappearances, I listen more attentively, no longer dismissing them so easily. Perhaps we are not the only intelligent beings claiming this land as home. The Phantom Huntress from Anon. I've spent most of my life in northern Michigan's woods, in a rugged wilderness my father claimed could swallow a man whole if he wasn't cautious. The dense forests and rolling terrain could disorient even experienced outdoorsmen, explaining the occasional missing person posters that appeared on utility poles each season. My family always prioritized safety, never venturing far alone, always adhering to familiar trails. 2 years ago, during deer season, something occurred that I've mostly kept to myself. It began on a gray November afternoon, when the air felt heavy with approaching snow. My cousin Jim and I occupied separate tree stands, about half a mile apart, watching for deer. I'd been there since dawn, when I noticed movement across a clearing approximately 100 yards away. Initially, I assumed it was another hunter, though no one else had permission to hunt our land. Peering through my scope, I clearly saw a young woman in a bright red jacket, the type worn for visibility during hunting season. But her movements seemed strange. She stumbled slowly, appearing disoriented. Concerned she might be injured or lost, I descended and moved toward her quietly, calling out softly to avoid startling her. Yet when I reached her location, she had vanished completely. Even more puzzling, I couldn't find any footprints or evidence of her presence. After searching the area, completely baffled, I eventually returned to my stand. About 20 minutes later, I spotted her again, this time in the opposite direction. Same bright jacket, same lost, wandering demeanor. I called out louder this time, instructing her to remain still while I approached. Again, upon reaching the spot, she had completely disappeared without a trace. That evening, I mentioned the incident to my older brother. He shrugged, suggesting either a visual illusion, or perhaps nearby campers who didn't realize they were trespassing, or who fled when I called out. His explanation seemed plausible, though the absence of footprints troubled me. The following weekend, I hunted with my skeptical cousin. We positioned ourselves within shouting distance of each other. After about an hour, I saw the woman again. Same coat, same cautious movement through the trees. I signaled frantically to my cousin, who nodded in acknowledgement. He saw her too. We quietly approached from opposite directions, but again found nothing. We searched thoroughly for any sign, but found no evidence. My cousin laughed nervously, suggesting perhaps it truly was supernatural, though I resisted that conclusion. Surely a rational explanation existed. Subsequently, we began hearing stories about the area. Apparently others had glimpsed a solitary figure, moving silently through those woods, always seemingly vanishing. Some suggested a connection to a decades-old disappearance, a young woman who had wandered from a nearby trailhead and was never found. One cold morning, I finally saw her clearly. Walking toward a hunting spot, she appeared directly before me, less than 50 feet away. She looked young, barely 20, dressed inappropriately for autumn weather, strangely out of place, staring blankly ahead. Her face seemed expressionless, unnaturally pale, as if immune to the cold. I stepped forward, speaking softly,
attempting to gain her attention. She neither responded nor acknowledged me. Instead, she turned slowly, walking behind a large oak tree, and vanished completely. I hurried forward, circling the tree, but saw nothing. Once again she had impossibly disappeared. This profoundly unsettled me. While I never felt threatened, encountering someone who couldn't physically exist disturbed me deeply. I began avoiding that area. Perhaps it truly was the missing woman, from local legends, her spirit trapped in the place where she became lost, continuing her endless search, even after physical death. When I do return to that location, I never go alone. Some spirits deserve company in their eternal wandering. The unseen abductor from R. Roy's. When I was about 10, my family owned a small hunting cabin, deep in northern Minnesota's woods. It was our weekend retreat, a place my father and uncle built themselves as young men, hoping to pass their love for nature to the next generation. My happiest memories came from weekends, when my cousins Arnold and Liam visited. We'd spend countless hours, exploring the surrounding forest, playing hide-and-seek through the pines, and constructing elaborate forts from fallen branches. The cabin itself was rustic, wooden walls, weathered by seasons, and a hand-crafted stone fireplace. My father built piece by piece. It permanently carried the comforting scent of cedar, aged wool blankets, and wood smoke. Our families established deep traditions there. Each autumn during deer season, our fathers would prepare meticulously for their hunts, sharpening knives with rhythmic precision, cleaning rifles reverently, arranging heavy hunting attire. The evening before, my mother and aunt would prepare hearty meals, while we children gathered around the crackling fireplace for tales of legendary bucks. Our fathers had tracked or gentler ghost stories that simultaneously terrified and delighted us. It was an enchanted time, until the year everything changed. One crisp afternoon, our fathers departed for hunting just after lunch, dressed in camouflage, promising to return before nightfall. My cousins and I spent the day as usual, roaming freely through the woods, getting pleasantly filthy, inventing endless ways to amuse ourselves, and equally endless ways to exasperate our mothers. As evening approached, we initiated a game of hide-and-seek, made more thrilling by the diminishing light. I remember concealing myself behind the old woodshed, holding my breath, when I heard footsteps crunching slowly through fallen leaves. Assuming I'd been discovered, I peered cautiously around the corner, only to see my father emerging alone from the forest. I called out happily, immediately asking about my uncle's whereabouts. But my father didn't respond. He didn't even glance in my direction. His expression was disturbingly vacant, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as he continued walking mechanically toward the cabin. I'd never seen him like this before. At that young age, I felt simultaneously confused and deeply unsettled. An instinctive dread formed in my stomach, the primal certainty that something terrible had occurred. We hurried inside after him, questions pouring from our mouths, but he moved past us wordlessly, collapsing heavily into a kitchen chair. My mother and aunt immediately recognized his distress and inquired about my uncle. My father remained silent, staring blankly at the tabletop, as though in a trance. Eventually, my mother directed us children upstairs. We complied without protest, somehow understanding that we didn't want to witness whatever would happen next. We huddled together at the staircase landing, straining to hear fragments of conversation drifting upward. When my father finally spoke, we caught disjointed references to shouting, panic, and a desperate search. Shortly afterward, headlights swept across the windows. A local sheriff arrived. A search party formed. They ventured into the darkening forest, alongside my father. For days, dozens of people methodically combed through the wilderness, calling my uncle's name into the indifferent trees. But they discovered nothing, not a single item of clothing, not one tangible clue. My father refused to discuss the specifics with his family. Even in his conversations with my mother and aunt, it became apparent they weren't receiving the complete account. For a time in my childish understanding, I wondered if my father might have harmed his brother. But they had always been inseparable, and I couldn't imagine any motive for such an act. The cabin, once our sanctuary of joy, transformed into a place of shadows. Our visits became increasingly infrequent, and eventually, my father sold the property. We relocated to a different state. My father needed to begin anew. Several years later, when I was a teenager, my father overindulged in alcohol one evening. After persistent questioning, I finally persuaded him to reveal what happened that day. His voice trembled as he recounted tracking a deer with my uncle. The forest had been quiet and familiar until my uncle suddenly froze mid-step, his eyes widening with alarm. My father said my uncle appeared to be staring at something in the distance. When my father asked what he saw, before my uncle could respond, he released a terrible scream and was violently thrown to the ground by some invisible force. My father lunged forward desperately, even firing his rifle wildly into empty air. But nothing connected with any target. My uncle was dragged through the underbrush, kicking and screaming, by something my father couldn't see. My father pursued, continuing to fire, until he exhausted his ammunition. But there was nothing visible to shoot at. My uncle's terrified screams gradually faded into an even more horrifying silence. My father searched frantically for hours, shouting my uncle's name, until his voice failed. But he found nothing, no blood, no tracks, no evidence of struggle. The forest remained eerily undisturbed. Local authorities, townspeople, and even family members repeatedly questioned my father, suspicious of his account. But what else could he say? He had witnessed his brother vanish, claimed by some unseen entity, knowing no one would believe the supernatural aspects. So he withheld those details, carrying that burden of knowledge alone. This revelation profoundly disturbed me. My father had never been one to fabricate stories, especially not to his children. He refused to perpetuate even harmless myths. He wouldn't allow my mother to maintain the Santa Claus tradition, insisting that deception, even well-intended, was a form of emotional harm. My uncle's case remains officially unsolved. My father avoids the subject entirely now. Attempting to extract details only provokes his anger. My cousins and aunt have gradually rebuilt their lives, though we all carry the absence of my uncle with us. Whatever presence haunts those Minnesota forests, it remains there still, waiting perhaps for unwary hunters who stray too far from the marked trails. If you ever encounter me crawling through the twilight woods while you're pursuing that trophy buck, please hold your fire. I might simply be searching for misplaced eyeglasses. Good night, my friends. Thank you for joining another episode of Unexplained Encounters. Which tale resonated most deeply with you tonight? Submit your personal encounters with the Unexplained Dark Stories.org, and don't forget to secure my new book, Creepy Campfire Stories, available for pre-order now on Amazon. Available for pre-order now on Amazon or through the link below. Be among the first 100 pre-orders to verify through the second link, and you'll receive the exclusive Darkness Prevails plush collectible. Shipping after the book releases on July 8th, 2020. Shipping after the book releases on July 8th, 25. Remember, only 100 of these limited edition plushies will ever exist, and I don't anticipate creating more. Pre-order Creepy Campfire Stories today and verify your purchase to claim yours. Thank you for your support. Until we meet again, stay vigilant out there and remember. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, power. And remember, embrace the darkness, for this world harbors mysteries beyond our comprehension.